Could I tell you a little bit about Satan? That in the court of heaven, Satan is the district attorney. He is not, as Christians imagine, the enemy of heaven and the enemy of mankind. He's merely the person who sees the bad side of things and carries out the dirty work.
Something that I find repulsive about especially monotheistic messianic religion. With a large part of itself, it quite clearly wants us all to die.
A new consciousness is developing which sees the earth as a single organism and recognizes that an organism at war with itself is doomed.
Welcome to Deferred Gnosis. We live in a world of Gnosis deferred. The primary purpose of Deferred Gnosis is to bring together contrasting perspectives to relentlessly investigate the whys and wherefores most are unwilling to explore. We will grasp those fleeting eternal truths necessary to liberate us from the shackles of sedentary belief. We will sharpen reason against the whetstone of radical thought. Welcome to another episode of Deferred Gnosis Podcast. I am your host, Shea, and I have the esteemed pleasure to have with me tonight a guest co-host for this episode. Jack, how are you? How are things going?
I'm doing great today, Shea. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to talk a bit about you and kind of how we met. That's an interesting story. Want to get into that. But for those new listeners, I want to take a moment to kind of talk a bit about myself. I'm a spoken word performance poet. I'm a musician. I'm a writer. I lecture on the occult. I do ritual performance. And from time to time, I am a podcast host. Jack, could you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. I'm an actor. I'm a director. I'm a writer. And I'm a passionate devotee of the spirit world, and I love magical and devotional technologies from late antiquity, and I practice Goetic magic on the side. So that's my bag, Shea.
Right. So we met at the International Left Hand Path Consortium in St. Louis, of all places, and it was just after I did this initial kind of group ritual for Hekataeon. It was kind of the opening ritual to start the 3-day event, the weekend event. And one of the early things I noticed is when I was throwing needles through my brow. Part of it was to kind of I do use blood in these performances, and I remember I had someone putting piercing my eyebrow, and I saw your face, Jack, and it looked rather transfixed.
I have to add my 2 cents at this point. Shea's being tactful when he says pierce his eyebrow. When I hear that, I see someone sitting on a booth at a mall, getting a small ring inserted. What it amounts to is, as we were waiting for the opening ritual for the Left Hand Path Consortium to begin, I heard one of Shea's friends say, "Are you sure?" And I heard him say, "Yeah, just do it quick." And I turned to look, and he was on his knees, and she was kneeling in front of him, holding these 3-inch lancets. And she gritted her teeth and slid one straight through the eyebrow from the base of it up pretty high above it, I thought.
Right.
First one, then a second, then a third on the other eye, and then a fourth. And the blood began to stream down Shea's face like this red river. And I thought, who the hell is this guy?
And then
that was just, the ritual hadn't even begun at that point.
Right.
That was just the prep,
I was surprised because it's a left-hand path convention, right? So I imagine, I assume that blood and things like that wouldn't be too shocking or too risque. You know what I mean? So
I do. And to be fair, I'm not saying everyone around me was shocked. I'm saying that I had never seen up close someone do blood work in a ritualistic context that wasn't like just as simple as a pricked finger or something like that. I'd never seen anything like that. And I found it shocking. There was a part of me that found it even frightening. And yet there was a part of me that found it just deeply, deeply fascinating and moving,
Right.
even.
And that culminated at the end. We went in to go for a hug, and I said, Jack, I'm going to get all my blood over you. And then
That's right.
you're like, whatever, who cares?
And in my closet to this day, my best shirt, the only one with French cuffs, is on a hanger, and the shoulder almost entirely covered in your blood. I'll have you know.
That's exciting.
That one never
yeah.
made it to the,
that's a
to
very,
the washing
that's a very
machine.
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be even more exciting when I use it for
It's
arcane
much-
purposes.
right.
The next time we fall out.
It's hey, it's also better than a love letter, you know? I think it's far more succinct, far more straight to the point. But you know, that does play into what we'll be talking about on today's episode. The left-hand path and this concept of the sacred. This idea that despite the adversarial, despite a lot of that, the severity within left-hand path traditions, and a lot of them are somewhat secular, a lot of them are militantly kind of opposed to religiosity. Some of them are militantly atheist even. But even for those who aren't, there's an eschewing of terms. There's an avoidance of terms like holy. There's an avoidance of terms like divine. There's avoidance of terms like the sacred. Mm-hmm. And the point of this conversation is to kind of dig into that and explore that.
Can hell be holy, Shea?
I like what you did there. I like what you did there, Jack. But you know, it's. I mean, we have to begin to kind of parse out exactly what we're talking about. So when we say if I have to, and a lot will be angry at this, but if we're gonna begin with the left-hand path, we kind of have to talk about the core satanic tradition or modern Satanism. And because the left-hand path is an umbrella now that has maybe dozens of paths that we can kind of go to. But if we look at kind of the core of modern Satanism, we're seeing, you know, essentially this is, you know, various forms of atheism. There's magic involved. There's definitely an anti-Christian, anti-Abrahamic, anti-theistic kind of ideal, say within the Church of Satan via, you know, Anton LaVey and his work. There's this idea that, you know, gods don't exist, the self is the god, and you see this mirrored and echoed throughout the left-hand path and definitely throughout Satanism and Luciferianism. The self above all, you know, atheism, as they've said. So in that sense, there's nothing divine and nothing sacred, at least within that context. You know, but if we then go out toward the different paths that are, you know, the left-hand path and the traditions that exist within that, things begin to open up a little bit more.
And I think it's fair to point out, Shea, that even at the left-hand path consortium, during the opening, they never defined what left-hand path is. And I think if you took a survey of all the people who attended, you would probably come up with a slightly different definition of what it is for every single person that was there. Yeah, and it's worth unpacking it just a little, I think, before we address this issue. I mean, you've hit upon some of the major notes as far as, you know, Satanism, Luciferianism, antinomianism, adversarialism. And as you've pointed out, some people take it from a purely rational, anti-theistic, atheistic even, viewpoint. But is there something they all have in common? Is there some kind of common thread here that makes something left-hand path, even for someone who's not, say, satanic, or even for someone who's not, say, an atheist or a theist? Is there something that can be pointed to that is a common denominator of all these different branches of that tree? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good point. You had mentioned that there's an umbrella of tradition. I think that's very important to understand. We are in a time when the occult is truly breaking open. This is the maturation of the internet, which initially kind of broke open and shifted many things, one of which was the satanic religion, opened it up to the world. But I think we're noticing some very significant changes in the various traditions, traditional witchcraft, left-hand path. I think, though, for the moment, I think what's important is we should probably kind of go into where we come from individually. Before we begin maybe cutting together these different traditions and where it may stand in terms of the divine. Jack, I at the consortium you had this beautiful kind of circular sigil. If I'm correct, it was from the Hekataeon. Is that right?
That's right. It was a magical circle from the Hekataeon, which is a grimoire from the early 1600s. It was essentially, the Hekataeon is basically priest magic, or magic for rogue priests, as it would be. It was a grimoire written in Latin around the time of Shakespeare, and it would have been a magical book to draw forth spirits of the air by calling upon angels through the power of the Abrahamic God. So not at all what people would automatically think of when they think of left-hand path, correct? Which typically is closer associated to the demiurge, right? Or an enemy of God, or an anti-theistic approach, perhaps.
It is within a Christian paradigm. Catholic paradigm would be more accurate, but
very much so, very much so. Which some people, and this is the interesting part, you're talking about how there's many different branches to this tree. And I imagine quite a few branches would say, well, you can't be left-hand path if you're calling upon the power of God to provide an angel to draw forth. You're not even drawing forth demons, which most of the grimoires do. You're drawing forth, quote, spirits of the air, which are intermediary spirits. The Greeks might have called them angelos, like Iris or Hermes or Hekate, spirits that exist between the celestial and the infernal realms. So I could see someone saying, well, that's not left-hand path. Although if I had to discuss that with someone, I would say to them, this was never orthodox. It was never doctrine. It was performed subversively by rogue priests. It was thaumaturgy. It was done specifically to benefit them in ways that were not allowed for and were considered a mortal sin by the church. So even though it draws upon powers that are thought upon as celestial, perhaps, there is something, I believe, deeply left-hand, if you like, about this form of magic, and I think that's defensible from that perspective. That's my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I think, and I think this is important for our overall discussion, because we are talking about this concept of what it means for something to be holy, and those lines start to become they start to blend and they start to become vague, especially in terms of the Solomonic magic, right? So this where you are, at least in its more traditional sense, you are calling upon the Abrahamic God to sometimes even threaten these spirits, and I know in the left-hand path and in Satanism, it is taboo. It is interesting to say that something is taboo. It is taboo to kind of treat these demons, or these daemons or daimons, with any type of aggressive threats.
Right. There's a lot of people who would think that anything that calls upon the power of the Abrahamic God, de facto cannot be left-hand path. But the fact is that even in traditional grimoire magic, you're calling upon that authority to raise either intermediary spirits or infernal spirits, and you're doing it for the purpose of coming into relation with them. You're recognizing them for what they are. You're calling upon them. You're introducing yourself. You're asking for something, but you're also entering into relation with them. And part of me, a very strong part, believes that if there is a common denominator in left-hand path, it will be incorporating the other, the outsider, entering into relationship with something that is not you, and maybe even directly opposed to you. And its concept sounds heady, but it can be illustrated. There's a great story by Michael Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, and he also wrote a book called Running in the Family, about growing up in Ceylon. And in his family's home in Ceylon, when he was a child, they would have occasionally cobras enter the house. They would just walk around the corner of a room and there'd be a large cobra in the middle of the living room. And they do what most people do, because cobras are very dangerous. They go get a shotgun, kill it, and then go clean up the mess. And this was a relatively common thing. Every couple of months, there'd be a new cobra in the house and they'd kill it. But then he tells a story that his father died at some point. And soon after that, a cobra entered the house that was larger than normal. And instead of being black, which was common, it was gray. And they did what they always did. They went and got a shotgun, and they pulled a trigger, and the gun misfired. And the snake slithered away. And it came back the next day, and they went and got the shotgun, and they pulled it, and the gun jammed. And the snake slithered away. And when it came back a third time, they went and got the shotgun, pointed at it from very close range, fired, and missed the snake. And at that point, the family had a conference, and they decided that this was too much of a coincidence, that this cobra had survived 3 attempts on its life, and that it perhaps contained the spirit of the departed father. And after that, they stopped trying to kill the cobra, and it returned, and when it was in the house, no other cobras would come near. And to that degree, they accommodated it. They incorporated it into their family and suffered no harm from it. This is a simple story, and it's true, apparently. But to me, it's a great illustration of a left-hand path approach. To see a cobra, something dangerous, something chthonic, to kill it, it's understandable. But it's a right-hand path reaction. To look at it, to analyze where does it come from? How is this thing perhaps in relation to me? To accommodate it, to synthesize it, to let it enter into your world, your family, so that you can live in relation to it. To me, that is a left-hand path approach. And so a lot of these different branches may have, one may be based on Lucifer, another Satan, another rationality, another antinomianism. But I do believe that, for myself, what they have in common is an attempt to synthesize, incorporate the other, which would otherwise be considered dangerous, foreign, or to some degree unwanted.
Right. That also, and that was a beautiful narrative, Jack. Thank you for going through that so eloquently. I see that there is a kind of a sub story within that narrative, and that is that this kind of underlines and supplements what you're saying. There is this family connection to the serpent in this case.
Yes.
There is this idea that within that serpent, they found a home, they found something sacred, they found a familial connection. Yes. And I think that, that takes what you're saying and takes it even a bit further. That is to say that there is this concept of finding a home. There is this concept of finding a deeply rooted spiritual connection, even to those who would claim a secular approach to all of this. There is this concept of some deeply rooted alignments that take place. These deeply rooted identifications that take place within these left-hand path traditions. I think it would be important, though, for us to kind of go into what the left-hand path is.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So, it's, we can kind of start to me, and again, there may be people who kind of disagree with this, but I do feel that the modern understanding or modern interpretation of left-hand path started in the 1960s, on the proliferation and the popularizing of what we call modern Satanism. This quickly opened up into things like Michael Aquino and the Temple of Set, which was the Setians is kind of falls on the same kind of moral and ethical code as LaVeyan Satanists did, but far more open to spirituality, far more open to forms of theism, as the Church of Satan wasn't. And that grew going into the 80s and 90s and the onset of the internet. Satanism kind of opened up. Now, there are precursors to that. There are precursors to the left-hand path going back about a century, but these are few and far between and rather obscure. If we talk about when this you have Kenneth Grant that can come from the Crowleyan school with his Night Side of Eden and his work with the Clipote rather. You can kind of see the beginnings of left-hand path identification. Kenneth Grant has become popularized in the last 10, 15 years or so as kind of a grandfather of the left-hand path. But what we see today is a myriad of groups that we can I kind of identify. Satanism, Setianism, Luciferianism, like you said, who identify with Satan or Lucifer. Chaos magic is thrown in there sometimes. It's because it's amoral. It's an amoral system. The middle path or traditional witchcraft or indigenous, Vodou, Kimbanda, Palomayombe. These indigenous traditions have curses and things in it. So as far as how we've defined magic, these are naturally left-hand path. Now, the concept of the left hand versus right hand, I think it cuts, a lot of it cuts into a concept of morality. Wouldn't you say, Jack? It's a question of morality and ethos, right?
I do, but I think it's important to note that these concepts are sort of a modern construct. Do you know what I mean? And we are exploring them here, but it's worth mentioning that they really do come from a binary understanding of the spiritual world, because they sort of imply there's good spirits and bad, there's good actions and bad, there's a good path and bad, and oftentimes, left-hand path takes on the eyeliner and black cape aspect of that, and leaving the halos and the wings to the right-hand pathers. But I hope we can both agree that there's an oversimplification here that is usually not found in older systems, where they, even though they may have gods considered adversarial, they certainly, their gods are much more ambiguous than we make them out to be now.
Okay, well, I think this is an important exercise. When I say right-hand path, what comes to mind for you immediately?
Well, to me, I think of sort of a Neoplatonic model. White robes, I think of people with bay leaves wrapped around their head. I think of someone, staring upwards, light beaming down upon them, doing theurgy, refining their soul to ascend, to do something that would, some sort of purification rite, or something that would make in them a purer, more refined self, something very abstract. Something that is meant to be an improvement upon oneself, to make oneself more consistent and acceptable to celestial forces that are so pure and so good and so remote that the only way one can approach them is by refining one's soul and one's sensibilities by theurgic acts. That's what I personally think of.
Right. So
of
when I'm. It's kind of interesting because I've played this question a million times over the years and heard it discussed and hear the terms discussed a lot. But when trying to actually frame it, I think we need to really come down to some fundamental differences. What you've outlined is absolutely true. Things that come to my mind is kind of this concept of adversarialism, right? So there's this antinomianism, this idea of breaking the laws, breaking rules, emancipation, liberation of confines, of constructs, of structure, of authoritarian type prescription, and things like that. You don't see that in the right-hand path, but rebellion is fundamental to the left-hand path. That's kind of the concept. I also think of things like lex talionis, the law of the claw, retributive justice, if one man smites you on one cheek, you smash him on the other, as Anton LaVey would say. But even outside of LaVey, as the left-hand path has come in the various forms of Satanism, whether traditional Satanism, the O9A, Orthodox Satanism, anti-cosmic Satanism, various forms of neo-Satanism, Gnostic, you see in all these groups this idea of defiance. You see this idea of breaking constructs, of the solve, of solve et coagula, the breaking apart, the dissolving of things that you don't see in the right-hand path. And I think the biggest thing that I think comes up a lot, actually, is black magic. That's been for the last 100 years, that's been the big kind of divider between the two. And that is, I'm willing to do curses and you're not. And but I think that speaks to a bigger difference. But what do you think, Jack?
That's a good point. But can you acknowledge this too, Shea? In our times, where the moral refinements seem to be getting increasingly heightened with each passing week, what might have been considered black magic 50 years ago, say cursing someone to kill them or blight their farm or make them ill, now people talk about black magic as, I'm going to do a spell to help me get the job, simply because that would cost someone else an opportunity. That the definition of black magic has been broadened so greatly that basically any act that is meant to benefit you in any way whatsoever in the real world, some people consider that black magic, basically. And I'm not saying it's a universal thing, but I am saying that the definition for what counts as black magic and perhaps as adversarialism seems to broaden daily as the list of acceptable actions to take and acceptable attitudes to have grows narrower and narrower and narrower.
Why do you think? I mean, because I do feel that we're living in novel time. I mean, we're living in novel times. There's a lot of chaos that seems to... We have movements that rise. Novelty rises in a moment. Entire things that we would have thought are not possible today or tomorrow, suddenly, even the most forward-minded individuals, when they're asked to prescribe what could happen in the near future, they say, you saw it in Trump's campaign, not to get on a political bent by any means. But as an example of novel experience and novel events, no, there's no way that will happen. That's such a... But we end up, in less than a year later, in a total different existence than what most even sensible or reasonable people thought we could exist within. So the paradigm switches. The zeitgeist seems to be flipping on its head constantly. Now, do you think that is a... thing? Or do you think that we're having a kind of... do you think that's more of an illusion of sorts?
No, I know exactly what you mean. And what's strange about it is you see often the old paradigms turned on their heads, in that what was once... You see certain groups that once advocated for free speech suddenly clamping down on free speech, urging that people be fired or persecuted or prosecuted for their exercise of free speech. You see other people or different groups that might have been advocates of people who are other, of people who are free thinkers, suddenly clamping down on that. And all of a sudden, the idea of adversarialism, the idea of rebellion, all of a sudden, sometimes it doesn't seem as if the old targets matter as much. It seems like there's a whole new array of authorities telling us what we can or can't do, what we should or shouldn't think, what actions are absolutely verboten, what thoughts should never be thought, and things never said. And to me, it's never been more important to grasp this idea of what it is to be a true adversarial, to think for yourself, to act for yourself, to know that in your own self-interest, you have to take certain actions just to preserve yourself and those you love. And if those actions are practical, then they are. And if they're magical or sorcerous, then they're that. But they're authorized by this system of adversarialism, which the left-hand path alone, I think, embraces, which is why in my opinion, it makes it so valuable today, so precious today, because we're being told more than ever before, and at least within my lifetime, what to do, what to think, what not to think,
We're
what
being
not
told
to do.
no. We're being told no. And
it's coming from all directions, too. It used to be just the government or your parents, or your boss. That's no longer the case.
Now you open up your feed and you see constant reinforcement, constant judgment, constant critique on what you believe, even if you're not speaking it. You may see in a meme that there's something wrong with your ideas. There's something wrong with what you're thinking. And
Absolutely.
What that does, and I've said it before, create an underdog and you create a hero. And I've thought this before. If you are telling someone, constantly telling them what to do, it's the hand in the cookie jar. And I think there is something satanic. There's something left-hand path that's involved. If someone's telling you no and someone's subverting your point of view, you're going to end up in a situation where they're going to strike back. That's just the way it is. And I think that has something to do with feeding the rise of the left-hand path in the occult world. And not just the occult world, it's all over the place. Genres of music, darkness that's depicted in even mainstream music videos. This has been happening for the last 10, 15 years, where there's an embrace of satanic imagery. There's an embrace of dark imagery. There's even a rejection of Abrahamic religion in some mainstream arenas, and actually a lot. So there is this spirit, this fiery kind of spirit of that's bubbling to the surface.
No, I would agree with that. And I think these times we live in are excellently suited for a resurgence of occult adversarialism. I mean, you know more than anyone, occult means hidden. And right now in our society, so little is hidden. Everything is exposed, from the way we use our credit cards, where we go with our phones, what things we search out on the internet. I go to the doctor, I get prescribed a medicine. On my drive home, I'm flipping on my phone, looking at Facebook, and an advertisement for the medicine comes up. They know already. So little is hidden. To me, it makes the idea of the occult so much more precious. To have something hidden, and what better to hide and have and contain and feed and cultivate than a sense of adversarialism in a world where there are just legions of forces, corporate, governmental, social, cultural, trying to control the way we think, act, speak, feel, and express ourselves. To me, one of the most valuable traits you can have nowadays is to sort of donkey-like dig in your hooves and say no further. I won't go in that direction, even if it's just for the reason that someone told you to. And that's the spirit, in my experience, that adversarialism encourages. And right now, I think there's probably nothing more precious than that.
Now, how does, in this kind of myriad of spiritual expression and identity, morality, ethos, and so forth, how does this work alongside our kind of conventional understanding of what it means to be sacred? As to most people, when they think about, various mainstream religions, you think of you think of a holy temple, you think of a church. When you think of things that are sacred, you think of a holy site. Sometimes that happens with some indigenous areas like Stonehenge, right? There's holy sites. But oftentimes you think of Mecca, you think of Jerusalem, for better or for worse. And you think of these different areas. You also think of a cross, you think of holy water, you think of, you may even expand that to secular sacred events, which I think is important to bring up. Things like marriage, things like birth experiences, birth of a child, death, funerary rites. So this idea, what's the common vein in that? What's the common vein in this? It seems like there seems to be something pure, right? Like there's something clean, there's something pure about these places and these experiences. There's something innocent about these places and these experiences.
You're absolutely right. And I think that is the shorthand so many people think is, if something is sacred, if something is holy, then it must be close to God, capital G. Holy water, water blessed by God, a holy place, a church, a place where the indweller is the Abrahamic God. And if that's your definition, then by definition, there can be no holy hell. There can be no sacredness or holiness in the left-hand path or an adversarial path, because it is typically considered to be, a path contra the Abrahamic tradition, or even, an authoritarian tradition. But I think that's far oversimplification, this idea that something sacred or something holy is just that which is associated with the authority, capital A, with the Abrahamic God, with the prevailing view. I think that's an easy out, and I don't think we should accept it.
Right. And Jack, you had mentioned to me earlier the etymological kind of root of sacred. And I think it'd be interesting to bring that up at this juncture. I think it's important.
That's interesting, and I did look up the words holy and sacred. Where do they come from? What's the root? Is there something that we can gain for that? And there's different theories and there's different sources for these words. Holy usually means consecrated to God. However, these words do have a root that can perhaps be traced back to the Near East, that reference to the words to punish or to fine, as in to impose a fine, which is interesting because some of the words for pray
sounds like a Satanist came up with that. Yeah.
I think so. And the word one of the words for pray references back to an old Near Eastern word for to notch, meaning to cut. So if you look at those words, to punish, to fine, to notch, those are not a typical synonyms we would think of for holy or
not
sacred. And it implies a different paradigm. They're not just saying of God. Root words like that imply that something is made holy or sacred by a cost associated with it, by something that was suffered to make them other than what they are, And it to a degree, it takes me back to watching you have lancets, shoved to your eyebrows, your forearms.
How interesting!
Well, covered them, and I looked at that, and even although I'll be honest, there was a revulsion in me while I watched it happen.
Oh, I think I saw it. Yeah, it's juicy.
And I could see. I'm sure that excites you more than anything else I could have said.
Yeah.
But there was also a fascination, and watching it, I had this strange feeling, this sort of electric feeling, that what I was looking at was far more similar to the way a magical ritual would have begun 3,000 years ago than any amount of waving one's hands or, reciting pretty poetry or rhymes or that sort of thing. There's a primitiveness to it. And afterwards, when you stood up there before everyone and lifted up your arms with the blood trickling down the forearms and the blood trickling in rivulets down your eyes, you looked transformed. And I thought to myself, he looks holy. And it's an ironic thought. There you are,
that's the first
an infernal aspect.
That's one of the first times someone has said that to me that I wasn't having sex with.
Well,
so this is definitely a first.
Well, I'm glad to be the first, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it was, and to me, I think it's interesting. I don't think we should cede the territory of what's holy and sacred. In my book, The Hekataeon, there's a way to consecrate a knife, and it seems like every grimoire has a way to consecrate a knife, right? But when one does it, you call upon a spirit from the PGM, the Greek magical papyri, was often called Bainkuk, and you summon it by a certain means, and you pass the knife through fire, and you say certain magical words, and once you're done, the blade, I call it there's a phrase that was used for the blade that killed Dionysus. It was called the Tartar Makare, which means the infernal knife, the blade of hell, basically. And that knife has been consecrated, right? But consecrated, it has the root word for, the word for sacred and for holy. Is that blade holy? Well, it's not associated with the Abrahamic gods, certainly. But that blade has been it has been purified and it has been made special to a force, a power, which itself is pure. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It reminds me of Alien, when the head of the android is describing the creature, and they say, "You admire it, don't you?" And it says, "I admire its purity." So I do personally think that things can be holy or sacred without them having been of the authority, capital A. I do believe that, and I think that's a large part of why I practice, is to find my own sacredness, regardless of whether it's one that's authorized by official dogma or doctrine.
Right. So there are some issues with, as we kind of went into a bit, in the occult tradition, the concept of the sacred, at least as the perspective of magic is concerned. One is we have to deal with the concept of atheism that exists in the left-hand path. Atheism, or the left-hand path, has a lot more instances of atheistic or, agnostic or non-theistic kind of belief. It's a substantial part. So we have to contend with that first, because I think that does define a bit of the satanic paradigm. There is this revulsion to what we call the sacred. There's this wanting to make things dirty, in a sense. There's wanting to corrupt, right? Not exactly that, but there's this concept that we are corrupting something holy. We are trying to scrape the psyche clean, as LaVey said, of all of the rules and prescriptions of morality that we've been given. So, if we think of secularism, we think of atheism within these traditions of the left-hand path. The next thing is to think of where does the spirituality come from? And when you think of where the spirituality comes from, there's this idea that magic could be exactly, it could be this mystical thing. Magic could be kind of psychological. So if I cast a spell to get a new job, really what I did is just raise my confidence. And right. That's what made it happen. Some people are in between. And some people just think it's what they call a psychodrama. A psychodrama meaning a mere performance, that is to produce a psychologically dramatic effect. Kind of I think exorcism, but I don't. But I know that's a loaded term. But it is to bring out emotions. It is to explore these emotions in a way that you're not, that's unfiltered. But having said that, where in that are we going to find the sacred? In terms of, we need to first figure out exactly what the root of the spirituality comes from. And you see that with a lot of the left-hand path. It is atheistic. It is, or partially atheistic, agnostic, or something like that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Jack?
That's a good point. And I would say this. I find the impulse, though I myself am not atheistic, I always have respect for those who sincerely explain that is their path, because to me it shows a deep integrity on their part to be honest about what they do or don't believe, or can or can't believe. Because as we all know, at heart, you can't make yourself believe anything. You can claim you do, but what you truly believe in your heart is based on your knowledge, your intuition, your instinct. And if you're honest with yourself, you either believe something or you don't. And no matter how many times you say you do, it doesn't change the fact. So for those people who say, I do not believe in another world, or a higher spirit, or a deity, or an authority, or any sort of spirituality, to me that's a very honest principle. And I think if there is something holy or something sacred about those people who don't even acknowledge deity, it is once again the fact that there's a standard they hold themselves to, a truthfulness about how they see reality, and are willing to share that in a way to increase the gnosis, the enlightenment of those they come into contact with. And although it's ironic, I'll point out that even in Platonism, the spirituality based on Plato's writings about Socrates, which are supposedly based on Pythagoras, it was supposedly based on the Orphics before him. But in Platonism, there were pure concepts. Numbers could be sacred because 1 + 1 would always equal 2, and 2 + 2 would always equal 4. And that was considered to be a sacred concept because it was unchanging. There was a truthfulness about it that had nothing to do with morality. Right. And so when I hear a Satanist say, I am an atheist, rationalist Satanist, I believe, etc., I look at them, and whether I believe what they believe or not, I respect their purity, and I respect their willingness to share their gnosis and the standard they held themselves to, because I know at some point they asked themselves, honestly, do I believe this or not? Is it true or not?
There is something to be said about... There are things that are philosophically sacred, right? So there's this idea of what, I actually talked about this a long time ago in the podcast, the idea of secular spirituality. But there are these experiences we have as human beings living in this world that are just transcendental. You may have where you had a dream. And then as soon as you wake up, you had a dream about a friend calling you, telling you about the fact that he got a new job and that for whatever reason he would like you to fly up, or a family member, you have a dream about a family member who needs you to fly up to go there, and you wake up the next day or something happens, they call you, I need you to fly up here. Right. I've had that happen a few times, or you have a dream about an event and then you see it repeat itself in the waking life. And it almost seems as if there's an organic pulse to reality itself, as if there is some form of communication between you and this amorphous concept. And regardless of that, because I feel like I'm beginning to personify it in a sense, there are these experiences that are not like standard experience. And I believe a lot of atheists, a lot of secular atheists, would agree that there are moments they're sitting in front of a concert, and just before it's going to begin to start, everything is black, the lights are about to show, but you don't know when the lights are going to come up and that first note is going to hit for the band, for that first opening song. You're not even sure what the opening song is going to be, but you know their entire discography, and you're waiting for something that you can relate to, spiritually, philosophically, and psychologically. And just before that, you feel this sink in your body, because you're suspended in that moment. And then when it happens and you connect during a certain verse, or there's a particular line in the lyrics, or it's when the bridge kicks and the chorus comes in. Yes. That transition of notes hits to something. Maybe you first heard it when you were 13 or 14 or 15, and it strikes back to that moment. And it's this powerful experience that transcends temporality, and it transcends space and time, and it's this charge of energy within you. Now, to some that may seem hyperbolic, but no, I don't think it is fucking hyperbolic. That is the way I've felt. I'm not playing with language here. Yes. I am merely describing what I've felt before, and what I think a lot of people feel. So whatever position you come from, secular atheist or not, you have had this kind of experience.
Yes, absolutely. That's beautifully said. The transcendence, that transcendent moment when you're somewhere geographically that you connect with, the transcendence of art, as you put it, when you hear a phrase or listen to a pattern of chords, the transcendence of pleasure, you eat something or drink something or with someone physically. There is a transcendence to the world, and it could be argued, I think, that most of us, spiritual or atheist or agnostic, spend most of our lives chasing those moments. And those who acknowledge an authority and are, more consistent with doctrine, call those things holy and of God or sacred. And I think those of us who are, those who are atheistic or those who are left-hand path have different words for them. But there is a universality to that ecstasy. There's a universality to being taken outside yourself and feeling that you're touching something that is either that is somehow of a parallel experience to your mundane self and somehow makes it all worthwhile. And it's something beautiful.
Right. This is what life is for.
I agree.
This is the kind of feeling that comes up. Now, I think when we now that we've kind of worked with this concept of agnosticism, atheism within the left-hand path, we have to then look at how things have developed since then, because there's been a noteworthy shift from this kind of atheistic drive. Now, this is something that exists within the left-hand path, more so than the right-hand path. And we could actually go back in our conversation where we're discussing the differences between the two. And one of them is kind of this idea of aggressive atheism or secularism and that. However, if you look in the last 10 years, even earlier, or 9-10 years, there has been, and this is because of the onset and the expansion of the internet, there has been a redefining of what the left-hand path is as far as their adherents. There is a sociologist, his name is James R. Lewis. He's an American sociologist. He wrote, I believe, his dissertation on the demographics or the history of Satanism, I believe. But I may be mistaken. But he's one of the American academics who's done a lot of work studying Satanism, maybe the first serious inquiry into the satanic religion, the satanic lifestyle. And what he found is he did three kind of... What's that called, Jack, when you...
criteria or aspects?
No, when you do a census. He did a census.
Oh, okay.
And he reached out to various satanic groups, asked them to send them out to their followers or to their members, and he did 3 of these. And he asked them questions on: do you believe in magic? Do you practice magic? Do you believe Satan is a real being? Would you describe yourself as an atheist? How long have you been a Satanist? Where do you what's your nationality? So on and so forth. Country of origin, things like that. And he did, I think his first one was in 2006, 2005. His second was in like 2008 or something, 2009. And then he had one in 2011. And in 2011, what you saw was an increase 2 or 3-fold of those who identify as theistic.
As theistic?
As theistic. So the amount of theists in the first run were something like, this is a sample of a few hundred people, so it's not the greatest pool, right, for this kind of study. However, this is a time when we didn't really have, people weren't on Facebook too much. It's 2005. Come on. So, and what came back is that most were atheists, something like 75%, 76%. By 2011, that number had actually went below 50%. The trend had been showing that something like 58% by that third survey. A survey, I guess what I was looking for. It was like 58% were identifying as theistic. That means they believed in a satanic or Luciferic god. Lucifer and Satan are real, and whatever other demon, real in a sense to them. And the practice of magic was far, like 80%. And that was now 8 years ago, and I don't think that's changed, because you're seeing a growth in Satanism in South America, in Africa, and these tend to lean theistic for whatever reason, cultural or otherwise. But the reality is the satanic community is growing in those places, and that's the places that had the highest percentage of theistic leanings when it came to Satanism. So it is safe to say that now, and you see this with the different traditions. I mean, Jack, you're a fan of the grimoire kind of scene. these rustic occult books that these finely, these limited hardcover edition, these talismanic, beautiful, rare books that are released by these various publishing houses that have this obscure kind of left-hand path knowledge or of various occult topics. And none of them are about atheism. None of them are about atheism or agnosticism. They are all about spiritualism, magic. They are about evocation. They are playing on old Solomonic tradition. They are finding new ways to express yourself in a satanic paradigm. They are about the klipots. They're things like Ixaxaar and the Tree of Death and this whole thing.
Correct.
So you see that we're now existing. The left-hand path can now be, this form of traditional theistic orthodox Satanism, the anti-cosmic tradition that's been popularized through the third wave black metal. And also traditional witchcraft, which some would argue are, left-hand path. The adoration, if we look in Gemagary's or Gemagary's work of the old horned one, and we look at the different adoration of the devil's cool again, the devil's okay again, this old Wiccan idea that the horned god is this castrated, effeminate kind of character, this new age cartoon caricature of a deity, bringing it back to this sexy, dark, horned god. So you see in different ways, there is a shift towards the left-hand path, and it is very spiritual. So
Yes. You're onto something here. I have a feeling that just like Romanticism was, in direct relation to the rise of industrialism, I feel like we're in sort of a new sort of industrialism, through information technology, social media, the digital world. And I have a feeling that it's created sort of a neo-romanticism, which is sort of the dark twin of the romanticism of the 19th century. And as it shows no sign of stopping, as this world, the world of information, grows increasingly aggressive to invade, what we used to be private, it used to be personal, it used to be, a very separate thing. I have a feeling there's only going to be an increase in the rebellion against that by reaching out to old forms, old systems of thinking, some of which may be theistic models of spirituality, and obviously, as you pointed out earlier, perhaps more often an adversarial path than a more typical one. It does seem to be a sign of the times, as they say.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I think it's as simple as returning back to a perhaps more historically accurate interpretation of these things. These gods sometimes were a bit more complex than just good or evil. This god helped you with matters of sex and war. This particular god helped you in matters of, if you take a perfect example would be the Dionysus character, which you're intimately familiar with. This kind of, this revelry, this concept of the revelry. And there was apprehension towards this drunken abandon. That was a warning towards it. But there's also a pleasure and a connection in this,
Absolutely.
In this kind of experience.
And one of the great reliefs of dealing with spirits from an older tradition is that they don't demand belief. It seems strange to say that though we distinguish now atheist versus theist, there wasn't such in ancient times. There wasn't such a division in this regard. We know that some people believe that the gods were real persons, and we know that some didn't. From so certain graveyards will proudly proclaim on certain graves that the person who died was an atheist. But what mattered back then is that people would sacrifice to the gods, that they would somehow acknowledge them and find blessing. And one of the offerings did not have to be a statement of belief. Unlike the Abrahamic tradition, you didn't have to believe in Artemis to receive blessings from her. You simply had to acknowledge her with the appropriate offerings on the appropriate day and time, and you'd be a fool not to. And I don't think it was, for many people, sort of this conscious, deliberate expression of belief. I think a lot of it was very intuitive, gut level, like the baseball player, who picks up his bat in a certain way on the World Series and walks up to the plate in a certain number of steps and whispers something to himself as he falls into his position. It was simply an intuitive way of dealing with the world. And if you ask them, do you rationally believe that there is a large personalized entity named Artemis, they wouldn't have known what you meant. They would have simply said, all I know is I'm going to give Artemis the offerings due to Artemis on Artemis's day because I want, good luck for my family, and I don't choose to tempt fate. That would have been their answer. And I think we've lost sight of that, and I think that may be a bit of what we're regaining nowadays as people reach out to a more intuitive, more instinctive relationship with themselves and with the spirit world, to the extent that there may be said to be one.
Yeah, that's a very important disambiguation to kind of explore. The conceptions of God in the left-hand path, because we were speaking earlier about what it means, what sacred means, and we often defer to some type of divine source. We defer to a god. We defer to a spirit. One contention that we have in kind of applying the concept of the sacred to the left-hand path is defining what it means to have gods. Again, this is not something that's not so clear-cut in the left-hand path. A lot of ideas that are there, we can kind of start with some. And that is, we have a common concept called the egregore, right? So there's this idea that we submit our thought form. This is the idea that we submit our thought and emotion and kind of impact, and that it creates an independent type of conscious being. That if we invest this energy, it may become conscious itself, if enough people do so, or if you even do so on your own, you can end up creating this type of being through your belief and through your investment of energy. There is ideas in traditions that do believe in external beings and daimons and things like that. But if we're to look at the self-created beings, if we were to look at this idea that these beings are psychological constructs, where is the God to make holy? Where is the spirit to make holy, if they're of our creation?
That's a great question. And I'll just throw out something, slightly controversial perhaps, is that if anyone truly believes in egregores, then they should just become Christian and Muslim right now. Because if there wasn't an Abrahamic God then, if the egregore model works, there certainly is now. And with between 3 and 4 billion people doing devotional work once a week all around the globe, that spirit is far more powerful.
Interesting observation, because it's one I've talked about for a long time. I used to have this thing I used to have this thing when I was younger. And people would tell me if God exists. And this is when I was 15, 16. I was still discovering my satanic kind of ideas. And I said, well, even back then, I just wouldn't say God doesn't exist. I felt I had a little bit more complex answer. I said, well, if you close your eyes. Jack, I actually think we had a conversation about it where I use this analogy now I think of it. I said, okay, so for a magician, they can open their eyes and they can see the canvas. And they know exactly where to apply the paint, because a magician has practiced spiritually. They've meditated. They've performed these things. They know how to direct their energy. right? So you might have someone who's able to use 80, 90, 100% of their potential in terms of spiritual focus. And then you take, a few billion people. Say they're just almost dead batteries. They are blindfolding themselves. They are throwing paint randomly onto a canvas. But here's the thing. They have a few billion shots to get it right. And what happens is you end up with a canvas that is covered in paint or spiritual energy or spiritual intention. So if we believe, you bring up a very scathing, for some people this would be a scathing reality to have to reconcile. No, seriously. Yeah. I mean, it's a very, because you do see the hypocritical idea. I've seen pagans that go, oh, well, fuck your old man in the sky. I'm like, wait a sec. You're a polytheist. Where the fuck do you get? I understand you believe in more progressive beliefs or something, or you accept people more, quote unquote. But you're telling the Christian that you believe in more than one. Well, they believe in one.
The same people that often say, well, there is no Christian God. That's a false concept. Are the same people that orgasm over the fact that 200 people believe that Slender Man is real. And they're like, he's real now because 200 people believe in it. It's like, well, by extension of that logic, you should be baptized tomorrow.
No, right. You bring up the very scary, and I kind of wonder where it comes from. Is it the idea that suddenly we became woke and they are these nothing people? Or these are people who have absolute, are they, now I know the right-hand path isn't so severe in its judgment, even though it is. But at least on the surface, they wouldn't admit to something like that. But when you say a Christian's God doesn't exist, but you're fucking 50 or 60 that you call down for your little crystals that have these associations to try to make sure that you feel good for the evening or that you purify yourself of some weird toxins you may or may not have had, you're saying that is all real. 20, 30 degrees of abstraction, but this Christian who says a God is real and that's it, and it's the only thing they believe, and you're going to say that's false? It seems absolutely illogical and ridiculous. You have to somehow reconcile the fact that if you believe in egregores, if you believe in combining energy to make these thought forms real, or if you believe in adding energy into these things, that your belief and your intention carries power, and anyone who casts magic, and they believe it's anything more than psychological, believes that this energy manifests in a magical way. And if you do believe that, then you have to also believe that billions of screaming Christians, Muslims, believe that you have to understand that there's a possibility that Yahweh, the storm god, is very real. Yes. In that context.
Well said. Well said. I mean, I think what it comes down to, and you nailed it right there, the egregore model is really, I think, a mask for the psychological model. Because the implication is, and you've heard there's plenty of anecdotes about this, that you create something by conceiving of it and acting like it's real, and then gradually it becomes real. And we all know that psychologically, to a degree, that can work in more mundane ways, where if you think of something a certain way, then it begins to take shape and form. Because, in a very real way, when you think of something, your mind is literally, creating connections physically in a certain way. And the more you think about it, the more those connections take hold and become firm and become well-traveled and become conduits for your thoughts. So I think in a way, the egregore model is simply a kind of a strange metaphor for something that is quite real, in that it's the more you think about something, the more your brain is shaped a certain way and is more conducive to think about it from then on. And sure, if that's what you're talking about, then that's what you're talking about. But if you're talking about true spiritual entities that are independent of our psychological model, then I really do think of myself personally, I find the egregore metaphor less than useful, because it requires a system, as you pointed out, that's deeply inconsistent. In that all the spirits that you want to be real because you thought of them exist, and yet all the entities that would just far outweigh them after millennia of billions of people making sacrifice to them and believing in them, those don't exist, or at least not in any way that affects yourself. And I think that's the weight of that concept can't bear under its weak foundations.
Well, I don't know if that automatically rules out that the egregoric... I mean, just the fact that these other gods exist in some fashion doesn't automatically exclude any new ones.
Yeah, there's still minnows, even though there's blue whales. I hear what you're saying.
All right. So when we look at these, whether they're egregores or not, when we look at the various gods and goddesses that exist, we see some trends, right? At least as far as left-hand path adherence is concerned. One common kind of demonic entity that we see from Solomonic tradition are the Ars Goetia's Ashtaroth, right? And in the Ars Goetia, Ashtaroth is this kind of three-headed bestial. There's like a frog, correct? It's like a frog head, and then like a prince's kind of head, like a man's head. It's this kind of bestial three-headed. Jack, you're the Solomonic guy.
No, I honestly am not an expert on I won't even pretend, on Solomonic magic. I do practice with Hekataeon, but I know enough, having read through different grimoires, that their their imagery they use for demonic spirits and of gods is quite bizarre. And I think it
right.
has value on a metaphorical
it's
level.
It's fascinating and it's beautiful.
Right. It definitely can be. And I think one of the most exciting aspects of grimoiric demons and spirits, the legions of hell, the dukes, the princes and such, is that sometimes they can be traced to be sort of descendants or reissues even, or revamped versions or even demoted versions of gods, of pagan gods. And you can see an echo sometimes in the demons of their predecessors, which were the gods.
And I was going to follow that line, and that's why I bring up Ashtaroth, is because as interesting as that figure is in Solomonic magic as a Goetic spirit, or demon, as they would say, demon, the word itself again falls into this, where it has a source that draws from ancient Greek tradition, and then it becomes this now malignant, severe, kind of violent, evil type of connotation. But you have Ashtaroth the demon that we believe comes from Astarte, from the Hellenic period, who we believe comes from Ishtar, Babylonian, and then finally Inanna from Sumer. So we can trace this kind of generational shift, and then what seems to happen, and this happens a lot, is with the proliferation of Christian belief, Judeo-Christian spirituality and religion, we see a demonization of these beings. That goes again with the horned god. You see all over, if you look at the work of Margaret Murray and others, and everyone who's read the first 5 pages of any whatever Llewellyn Wiccan book they find at Borders or Barnes & Noble, they'll see that they'll see mention of the horned god, this horned male figure. There was instances of the horned god in the shape of Cernunnos. You have Pan, you have Dionysus, so you have the instances of these horned deities all throughout Europe. And then you see, as soon as Christianity took hold, Pan, of course, that Satan took on this horned figure, which was not depicted as such before that. So you see these types of these instances where you see a demonization of these beings into something sinister.
That's exactly, you're exactly right. And you see it with Hekate as well. As early as the 2nd century, when you get one of the proto-grimoires, Testament of Solomon, you all of a sudden you find Solomon summoning demons that are, these feminine spirits with 3 heads that come from the moon and take on many forms. They're clear descendants of Selene, of Hekate. And there's a Gnostic word called pistis Sophia, the trust or the faith of Sophia, in which Hekate, as well as several other gods, appear literally in hell as sort of the tormentors and keepers of souls that need to be purified for their sins on earth. And it's not too big of a stretch. One of Hekate's epithets was Tartarukos, meaning the keeper of Tartaros, which was the deepest level of the Hellenic underworld. It was meant to contain those who were most dangerous and most sinful. So let's be honest, it wasn't completely inconsistent with some of the functions of characters like Hekate or Adonis or Hades or Chthonic Hermes. Some of these Greek spirits did have a very infernal aspect, and it wasn't the world's biggest leap to transform them into demonic spirits. But you definitely see it, and you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to horned gods. It's often been recognized that the Christian devil looks a lot like the Greek Charon, who was typically pictured as sort of hook-nosed and slant-eyed and grimacing, sort of merged with Pan, the horned god who would have goat legs and horns, or Dionysus, as Dionysus Zagreus was the horned child, and in whom were merged the bestial and the mortal aspects. So you're right, you combine those together and you come very close to the image that we think of nowadays when we think of the Christian devil. Which is it's interesting to have, quote, lower spirit have such respectable roots, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there's something interesting to be said about this because we're looking at the transformation of these maybe indigenous spirits. And they evolve into these different types of beings. In the case of the Goetia, in the case of Satan, from a Judeo-Christian prescription or description, how much of that holiness is retained? And I think initially we would like to imagine none of it. Initially, through a Christian's eyes, clearly these are not holy beings anymore. But come enters stage left, the left-hand path, and Satanists and Luciferians, and they do become holy again because we're not just revering their old form, right? We are revering something sinister, something in between what has happened to their form and between what they were in an indigenous sense. We do work with Goetic spirits, although we do not do so usually within the same context as what you described actually towards the beginning of the podcast in your practice, which is calling upon solar spirits or Yahweh to kind of command these, kind of the traditional Solomonic tradition, to command these beings to do your will. In the left-hand path, we invite them in. They're our brothers. They're our friends.
Yes.
They're not these really evil beings. So now they're these guides. There's these spiritual advisors. They're spiritual brothers, these beings that are here to help us. I argue that is bringing it back to what they originally were, even in their sinister outward appearance.
I think you're onto something here, and here's why. What most, neo-pagans or modern witches or people like that fail to understand is ancient spirituality was much more conservative than we think of it now, was much more cynical in ways than we think of it now, and was much less binary than we think of it now. People didn't just worship Artemis, they feared her. People didn't just worship Hermes, they feared him. They didn't just worship Apollo, they feared him. These gods, they didn't have an anti-Apollo. They didn't have an anti-Artemis. These gods were themselves, what they gave with the right hand, they took away with their left. Apollo could heal. He was a god of healing, but that meant he could also make you sick And the Iliad has a story about how he sent arrows bearing plague into the Greeks' camp to punish them for taking the teenage daughter of the Trojan priest Chryses. He could make you sick and he could make you well. So if you worshipped Apollo, it wouldn't make sense to say, we write a left-hand path, worshiper of Apollo. It's like, I worship Apollo. He is both, his name seems to come from a root word meaning the destroyer. We've lost that sense now in modern, reconstructed neo-paganism and witchcraft. And the same could be said for each of the gods. They could make you, those who could make you sane could also make you mad. Those who could bring you good fortune and stability could also destroy you at a moment's notice. They were extremely dangerous, and they weren't all one thing. They weren't all good. And so in that case, with that model, it wouldn't make sense for someone back then to say, well, I don't worship the gods. I worship the darker forces of the earth, because the gods themselves were deeply, they had a chthonic aspect. They had, certainly in the archaic age, they had a dark and an underworldly aspect. They were dangerous, but they could bless as well. It all depended if you came into relationship with them. And now, when we live in such a binary age where there's good and there's bad and there's black and there's white and there's right and there's wrong, to call upon infernal forces and to actually say, I want to enter into relation with you. I want to treat you as an equal, as a guide, as a guard, as a mentor. I believe that what you just described is a step back toward the old model, where we understand that these spirits are neither all one thing or the other. It's a step beyond a childish understanding of things, which is that there's something that's all good and something that's all bad. And as we know, that is one of the earliest and most painful illusions to discard. And yet so many people nowadays cling to that their entire lives. And I've never heard it expressed as articulately as you just have, this sense of calling upon a spirit which is infernal, something as dark or has a reputation for deviousness or dangerousness as Lucifer or Satan or Ashtaroth, and to say to them, I come not to bully or punish you. I come to enter into relation with you. I think that is true gnosis, in that it discards 2,000 years worth of illusion and returns to a primal archaic model of spirit work.
It well said, and I think it reminds me of something I've said for years, and that I've liked to say, that I have perceived the face of God, and it is an ugly one. And I actually came upon saying that after a few experiences with psychedelics, and I remember the times that I broke through. The times that it took me to the edge of experience. It's done this, psychedelics tend to break down the constructions that we've had in daily life, these expectations of what reality is, these assessments of who you are and what the world is and your relation to it, and so on and so forth. And whenever these hit a transcendental point, there is this nervousness that what you are approaching is absolutely terrifying.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's you're reaching what we've come to call God. You're reaching this omni-awareness. You're reaching this awareness of what you are in the world. And sometimes the difference between the two, in a very Buddhist detachment sense, that the difference between you and externality is bridged. And then so this concept of God arises as in the highest divine experience, what we were kind of mentioning earlier. This lifting of casual experience suddenly blows out completely. And that's what nirvana means, to blow out. And to blow out the ego, to blow out burden, to blow out attachment. And so when you reach this almost deafening silence, that is this interaction with the divine, either through psychedelics or very exceptional magical or spiritual expression, I sometimes found that through suspension, and that's something we may talk about at some point as a spiritual practice. But you notice this immense beauty of connective experience, but at the same time, there's this sinking in your stomach that what you're viewing is alien somehow.
Yes.
That it's immense, that it's dangerous,
yes.
that it's primordial. And that in itself is terrifying. And I think that speaks to what you were saying, Jack, that the face of God is a terrifying one. Or it should have, that it's natural for the divine face to have a grimace, for it to have these kinds of features that we see in human life, because we are merely reflections of it, right? I mean, it's not so strange to think that humans are so far disconnected from this divine experience.
Exactly.
That would be silly. By any reasonable assessment, we are a product of said experience. It would be silly to think we're so far removed, but we experience this fear and trepidation and terror, which is mixed with elation and holiness and the divine, and you see it described for thousands of years. Everything in Jewish mysticism, this idea of reaching the throne of God and it can kill you. The mere sight of God, if you look at God with any emotion or perception, you'll be turned to dust or cast out. Like the story of the Zephyr Yetzirah, where you're warned of the three that go to the throne, and one of them desires it, and he's burned into flames, and the other fears it, and he runs forever, and he dies in fear, and the other sees nothing. The other closes his eyes and doesn't open them for a moment, and he's able to leave with enlightenment. So there's this concept that approaching the divine, that it is something so beautiful and terrible at the same time. So what we're talking about here is that it seems completely natural, and it's a story we've been telling through these various traditions around the world, that it isn't so simple as good and evil. That's silly. That's silly, because even in Judeo-Christian, you see that God can be a terrifying individual. He can cast you into this punishment. He judges. He kills. He desires.
Absolutely.
So,
it's like that old Bible phrase, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. and as far as what you said about the face of God is an ugly one, I think it may be literally true. If you Google online picture of Yahweh, they discovered just this past year a drawing.
Oh, that's right.
You've seen it too. Oh my God, he looks like 5 miles of rough road in that
it's
image.
Fascinating. Yeah, no. Okay, actually, we could talk about that picture, and I might be able to post something in the episode, a link to this image so you guys can take a look at it. But they recently found, I believe it's in Mount Sinai, they did a excavation that had a pot, and there was art on the pot. And what it depicts is there seems to be two people. They're badly drawn. Kind of looks like they're drawn by like a 12-year-old, 11-year-old.
Exactly.
And they both have horns, both have what appear to be hanging phalluses.
Yes, and Yahweh, to give him credit, although he's ugly as a Mack truck, he's hung like a horse, so let's give credit where it's due.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I do have to say, to go back to what you said earlier, that sense of sort of that sacred experience, which is available even in infernal paths, in left-hand paths. You'll see writers write about crossing the abyss, right? Or encountering sort of the soul-destroying forces that they seek to evoke. And the language they use of what that experience is like, in very real way, can be said to mirror, similar accounts by Buddhist monks, or Tibetan spiritual practitioners, or even, let's say, Jewish or Christian saints that have entered so deeply into the mysticism that they feel that they have lost their ego and have touched something far beyond themselves. There is, I think you've actually put your finger on it. If there is a holy or a sacred in an infernal path, in a left-hand path, it comes from that instinct to lose oneself so completely, to approach forces and powers that are so dangerous and are so outside of the norm, what is acceptable, what is authorized, what is safe, that you lose all sense of who you are. There was a time in my path when I would try new things, when I would know I was on the right path if I was nauseated during the rite or during the act. Afterwards, I'd know if I felt, literally physically ill, that I'd approach something real. And I can only imagine for those who go far deeper and further than I have and actually touch that abyss, or what some people call the black sun, or others call, the heart of the mystery, that experience must be, if that's not sacred, then nothing is. And even if your paradigm is infernal or left hand or whatever, there's no denying the courage that takes and the effort that takes and the sort of soul-destroying contact with something so far beyond reality that you're permanently transformed. It truly, if that isn't sacred, then what is?
Nah, it sounds sexy as hell too. I think finally we should probably touch on this idea of to consecrate. And we kind of touched on it a little bit. When we think of what is sacred, we think of temples, we think of holy ground,
right?
We think of things like that, and want to kind of bring that into the fold. We discuss God's beings, spirits, and things like that, but to kind of bring this idea of consecration, making something magical, making something holy. I think that's an important part to kind of explore if we're talking about the sacred. There are some psychological conceptions of this. We do hear within magic this concept of vibrations, that you see the haunted ghost hunters. I feel a vibe here in my instrument. Right. I'm recording white noise. There's got to be someone talking in it and stuff like that. And there's this energy. People talk about vibes, and they give psychological explanations, but sometimes they often sound like there's more to it. I remember reading, it was my first occult book I picked up when I lived in Long Beach, California. There's this massive used bookstore called Acres of Books. It was now taken down, like a lot of the old bookstores, unfortunately, around the United States. But this one had over 1 million books anyway.
Wow.
As I'm reflecting on it, with passion and I had fond memories of that time. But I remember walking, I was about 12 years old. It was my first occult book. I see a book by Dion Fortune called Psychic Self-Defense. And I didn't know what it looked rustic. It looked kind of older. It was a tome from this printing was from the 1930s. It was written in like 1912 or so. And I opened it up and it had all these crazy stories, which is why I got into the occult, because I'm sitting here 12 years old. She's talking about fighting a werewolf. She says she wakes up and there's this werewolf standing at the foot of her bed, and it's following her every night. And one night she pulls it into her solar plexus and realizes that it was this ectoplasm that took form as a thought form, as this werewolf creature. And Dion Fortune is a theosophical writer, but a lot of these theosophical writers at the turn of the century wrote rather, their work was rather fantastical.
It does sound very Jungian, doesn't it? Taking in that shadow self, absorbing it, incorporating it, owning it, coming into a relation with it.
That it was a part of herself. Absolutely.
The term ectoplasm is kind of funny now. I think of Ghostbusters, but you can, if you look past that, you can see a really powerful and moving, imagery for owning that dark and frightening aspect.
That's right. And I mean, going on to that same werewolf concept, I remember reading in The Devil's Notebook, I believe, by Anton LaVey, he talked about hauntings, and he says hauntings were caused by weird angles in a room. And I don't know what to think about that, but he said there's certain places that carry a certain energy that is so compacted that it has its own spirit. And he talks about how we can play upon that energy, and he writes this werewolf ritual, how to turn into a werewolf, that you go to this place at night with no one around, and you go by yourself. Yeah. And you go there naked and you begin acting like a wolf.
Yes.
And you allow that fear and that primal energy to take you over, and that you will find yourself forgetting what happened for the night and things like that. So LaVey lays out this ritual on how to play onto a haunted place to become this bestial kind of creature. So there's these ideas even amongst the I'm not saying Dion Fortune was an atheist, not by any means, but there's this idea that vibrations, that Dion Fortune also talked about a place that had a concert. I always had trouble imagining the venue, but she talked about how there was a particular energy there where a head would manifest just above the stage and would stay there and stare at the performers. Like there was this spirit that stared at them, that was some disembodied being that was attracted to the energy of the performance. So there's these stories that various occultists have come to kind of explain what could be a psychological experience. But
yes,
you kind of deal with the more archaic forms of these kinds of things. You kind of mentioned it before.
Right. Right. When you've got, and that's one of the differences between spirituality in antiquity as opposed to spirituality in contemporary times. The difference is nowadays much of the talk is about energy, specifically among more New Age, more Wiccan models, but the word energy gets brought up repeatedly. And energy is, of course, it's literally a real thing. Our bodies have energy. Everything has a certain level of it, but they refer to it in a spiritual sense, whereas if you concentrate, say, on a magical tool, you can give it your energy or touch something, imbue it with your energy, or look at it in a certain way, you imbue it with your energy. That, that's a concept that has a lot of purchase nowadays. In antiquity, they didn't think that way. They didn't believe that way. They didn't think of energy the way many people do today. It wouldn't have made sense to them. They didn't believe a person could have so much, quote, energy within them that they could transform something. Much of the model of magic in the spirit world dealt with spirits. And someone who was a sorcerer, a priest, a priestess, a magician, they had one thing to consecrate, to do magic that normal people didn't have. They had what Garth Brooks had, which was friends in low places. They had access to spirits. They had intermediary, disembodied beings that would help them. And so if you wanted to consecrate something, make it sacred, make it holy, you called upon a spirit to take up residence in that item. And it could be a small doll. They had what they called kolossoi, which was a small doll. Or, for instance, if you wanted to get rid of a spirit in your house, you wouldn't say, my house has bad energy. You'd say it was haunted by a spirit. You'd create what looks like a small doll's house, invite the spirit into it, and then remove it to a different place. You believe that an actual being would take residence. And likewise, if you wanted to imbue a sword or a shield or a wand with some sort of magical force, it had nothing to do with spirit, with vibrations or energy. It had to do with inviting a spirit to bless and even take residence in that item, so that when you access the item, you access the spirit. And to a degree, we can see this in the idea of the, in Greek myth, when Medusa's head is cut off, it is incorporated into the armor of Athena. It's in a shield. It's called the Gorgonian, and that shield contains the power of Medusa. After that, in that those who look at it will turn to stone. The spirit of Medusa lives on in the shield. And that is a very archaic and model of magic, inviting a spirit. So by that model, if a person were to call upon an infernal spirit and ask it to imbue a knife, a wand, or stone, a mirror, then that would become, sacred to that infernal spirit, holy in regards to that infernal spirit, under an antique, archaic model of magic. So I think that, in my opinion, tools and items can become sacred and holy through consecration-type rites, even if the spirits you're calling on are quote-unquote left-hand path or infernal or chthonic spirits. At least if you accept that model of archaic magic, which is that spirits like taking residence in things, and if you invite them to, they will do so, and thereafter imbue it with something of themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's actually a fascinating, if you look at the archaic concept. And I don't think, I think if we take it as, if we analogize it, or we kind of have some metaphorical flexibility, we can see that this has not moved too much. When we think of an item that means a lot to us, whether it's a good luck charm or amongst an occultist and an autome or an object that carries power, there is a spirit to it. When you talk about tequila, they believe that there's a spirit to the plant. Yeah. If you look at the work of Carlos Castaneda, and he talks about peyote, talks about that there's a spirit that exists within that peyote. Right. When we talk about absinthe, we talk about the green fairy. There's this being that is inherent, or this fairy creature that exists within the plant itself. When we think of psychedelics like datura, or the jimson weed, again, this is a kind of solemn woman that appears to you and bestows upon this experience of the psychedelic. So there's this, there is the, I don't know how far we've moved from this conception that you're talking about. This is something that still exists a lot of the times in indigenous practices.
Yes,
but
Shea, you've put your finger on it right there, because I think it's most oftenly encountered in indigenous practice, which obviously many indigenous tribes are still, their practices are consistent with archaic European practices. And to that degree, I think there's an element of universality about believing that in a pantheistic way, that every sort of tree, bird, stone, herb, mountain, river contains its own resident spirit, which can be accessed, entered into relationship with, and perhaps may even rub off on something other than itself. And I think this is, it's absolutely true that this still exists, but often you would have to go to find, valid versions of it that are not, have not been interrupted. You have to go to South America. Or perhaps you go to, Northern Asia or Africa.
Well, I mean, where it's commonplace, by the way, it's matter of fact in those places, amongst shamans in those
Correct.
circles. There's no even, you might as well be it might as well be as hyper-materialist as something like scientific inquiry. You ask them about spirits in these plants, for them it's no question.
Correct.
For them it's not even it's objective truth for them. And sorry, Jack, I just wanted to make sure that connection needs to be made clear. When you're talking about ancient Greece and you're talking about how the difference between belief, how that's not a concept, it's just something we don't fully understand today. Being primed in a Judeo-Christian Western context, we do not fully understand this idea that they didn't need belief, but they still gave sacrifices to God. What does that even mean to us? It's very difficult for us to understand that they didn't need to believe to reap the benefits of worshiping a God. That's insane. It's insane to us. But it was commonplace then.
It is very true. It is very true. And I think, but like the idea of pantheistic beliefs that you brought up in other cultures, in more indigenous cultures, you can still see it reflected in places that we, sometimes consider scornfully backwards. If you look, you can see examples of that old sense of sacrifice, of offering in places like Eastern Europe, in places like South America, or even southwestern United States. I remember going into New Mexico, a very small church in a very small town, and seeing a woman with a veil shuffling down an aisle on her knees toward a statue of the Virgin Mary to light a candle and kneel before her. That act of humility, of deference, of holy fear, it would be recognized. An ancient Greek who worshipped Artemis, who saw that, would understand what they were seeing. An ancient Greek who worships Artemis, who sees a bunch of Wiccans naked raising a cone of power, would not understand what they're seeing. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
To a large degree, many of the ritual practices that we think of today as being magical or neo-pagan or witchcraft have far more in common with early Gnosticism than they do with early paganism, in that they are reactionary. They are reactionary against a patriarchal, authoritarian, monotheistic religion. Doctrinal Christianity says dress modestly, so go naked. Doctrinal Christianity says, be chaste or have one partner. So,
right.
The reaction is have many partners or sleep with whom you want or do whatever.
Sure.
It's reactionary in large sense. And that's not to throw shade. It's part of the antinomian vibe too. And 1800, 1900 years ago, you had antinomian Gnostics who were doing everything they could to separate themselves
Absolutely. Well, it's forms of asceticism.
Yes.
You see that with the Agora,
Absolutely.
with the Agori today
Absolutely.
in Vedic
Especially
tradition.
when paired with the intention to separate yourself from the demiurge.
The
to
more
divorce.
corruption of the physical, the better.
Yes, and the intention was everything. So you can't, if you're modeling that, I mean, you yourself incorporate into your spirituality, and I hope we can discuss that further on the next episode, the element of cutting, of piercing, of bleeding. That would be recognized by an antinomian Gnostic from the year 100 AD. He would understand what he's seeing. And I think that that whole model is, I make choices to separate myself from the authority. It can't just be like modern day, I blew someone in a rest stop last night, I must be Gnostic. Like, that's not... That's not
Yeah, no. You can't grandfather in.
Right.
You pointed to kind of some of my own expressions of spirituality. I think, if I may talk about my first time doing body suspension. This is where, for those who aren't familiar, this is where you take, they also call it extreme piercing. This is where you take hooks and you push them, half an inch under your skin into the dermal layer, and then they lift. They take these wires that are connected to these hooks, and they lift you up and they suspend your body by your skin. There's many different reactions to this experience, but it is undeniable that this is a form of spiritual or heightened spiritual experience. It's almost no denying it, no matter how you cut it. For me, I have a penchant for the spiritual. I've been in the occult since I was a child. So there's no mistake there. And I'll make no qualms about it, so to speak. However, when I first suspended, I have an issue with I have a very busy mind. If you can't hear it in my voice, I'm very energetic in this regard. And I often can't still my mind. I have thoughts that shoot out constantly. And I know there's many who are listening who probably suffer from that too. So I know I'm not alone in this, in this condition or in this state of mind. When I suspended for the first time, I was in the lotus position where there's two on your legs, there's two on your back, and you lift into this meditative posture that you often see in some of the Vedic or the Hindu representations of gods. They're in this lotus cross-legged position. And when I lifted up, there's this incredible sharp pain that ran through my body, and then instantly it was gone. And what followed was I became still of mind. My thoughts had shed away. I had no thoughts for what seemed to be 20 or 30 minutes.
Wow.
I barely became aware that the kind of the guy that was running the cables, and he had directed everything. He saw that I had become very calm and still, and so he started swinging me. And so I began swinging under this tree because I was suspended under a tree in this lotus position. And I began swinging, and he kept swinging me more and more to the point where my body would literally almost turn to the side in the momentum that I had swinging around. And for me, it was one of the most peaceful experiences I've ever had in my life. To me, that was a sacred moment.
That is astonishing. I've seen the picture, which is on your Facebook page, of you suspended by the hooks. And I have to say, I find it terrifying. But to hear your description of it is mesmerizing. It must have been remarkable to find that silent space that you found.
I think it's a testament. We talked about context and we talked about perspective. I think it says something to the left-hand path antinomian tradition that also existed in the archaic tradition, as you mentioned just a few moments ago. It is through this paradigm of arduous, an arduous path, or adversity. In that condition, I chose to flourish rather than see it as being fearful. I broke through in that instance to the other side after I faced trepidation, after I faced pain, after I faced all these conventions that say this is incredibly painful, this is not normal, you shouldn't have hooks into your skin, and all of those are valid. We avoid pain. That's a natural fucking just drive that we have, right? And as you face these various conditions of adversity, and you do so without fear in your heart, there's a saying in this book by Leela Wendell, this necromantic ritual book is what it's called. And it's this lovely little grimoire and tome. And in the beginning, she has this picture of a death saint. And under it, he says, I saw an angel bearing 7 stones and 7 signs, but not a word of fear. So even unto the gate of death, the west gate, there's many things that you see in this struggle, in this situation, this experience, but not a word of fear. And I think that says a lot about the drive and spiritual rigor that exists within the left-hand path. And I think, furthermore, what I did is I created my temple when I do that. Whenever I do piercing and use blood work in these ritual performances or in group ritual or any of these things that I'm doing, I am creating a holy space. And I do it in a way that so when you said you saw shock and you were transfixed, to me that created a holy space.
Yes.
That created, in the least, even the atheists who may be listening or that would listen to this kind of discourse and this discussion, even atheists would have to admit that is a shocking experience.
Yes.
If you're driving by on the freeway and you see 2 people that are tossed out of their car and they're slammed against the concrete, you stop your car and wonder, because it reminds you about your own mortality.
Exactly.
And it reminds you how quickly and how immediately this entire story you've been building since the moment you were born can be ended in a moment that you had not planned whatsoever, not at your fault by any measure. It's the reality of entropy in the universe we live in. And so when I use blood, it is because in our modern world, we're so far removed.
Yes.
Even though we see violence everywhere on television, we don't see death like we used to. We don't have our sick that live in our houses and die in front of us. We don't do these things. It's completely removed from us. The minute our parents die or a family member die, they're removed on some stretcher, they're cleaned up, we see them in a suit, and then they're buried under the ground for us to never see again. We are removed from the violence and death experience, although we see it in our video games, we hear it in our music, we see it in our shows. When we actually see it in front of us, it is transfixing.
Yes.
It is absolutely mesmerizing. I do it in my group ritual performance acts, and I do it in those group rituals because I know what it elicits in those looking, what it elicits in those participating. It looks shocking. It looks violent. It looks out of place, and it creates what I call a holy space.
That's fantastic.
In a left-hand path tradition.
And I never would have thought of it in that way until you explained it. But from that context, I love the idea it's holy not only because internally the state it puts you in, because of the state it puts the viewer in, which is shocking them out of their comfort zone, out of their illusions, out of their expectations, and to some degree out of the lies we tell ourselves, which is that we're invulnerable and we're immortal, and that's never going to change. It's a reminder of mortality, like ecce homo, behold the man. And I think for that moment, when you undergo that, you suffer that, to do that for yourself, for the benefit not only of yourself and whatever forces that are to be placated or invoked, but also for the audience. It's a holy experience for the audience, and it sounds like it's a holy experience for you too, and we join in that. And it's beautiful, and I think it's very special in its way because it involves both sacrifice and transformation. And by that, holiness is created far more than if you just painted your face red, or marked yourself up with a Sharpie.
Right. So where is this all going? I mean, we're talking about these new transitions and these new movements. The clearly left-hand path is establishing itself in a new burgeoning era of left-hand path spiritual expression, traditional witchcraft. The occult is moving and shifting. The zeitgeist, the world is all shifting together, and along with it, those of us who sit on the fringe. where do you think this is all moving? Where does the story like mine, clearly this is becoming more common, I would say. What I just described is not, I don't think it's as rare as we would think. These are entire communities that are built around this. This is becoming acceptable practice in many wings of our culture. Where is the idea of the sacred going?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I will say this, even though I've spent pretty much the whole episode decrying the nature of binary thought, I have to end by saying I think it's going in one of two directions, perhaps at the same time. One, that left-hand path that was burgeoning may just become, the temptation may be that it just becomes a brand. It's wearing black clothes, it's buying a certain type of music, it's wearing a certain sort of jewelry, and it requires really nothing. And if that is the case, then there's really no sacredness or holiness that can attach to it, because it's corporate, because it's simply a means of self-expression, like, you know, cutting your hair in a faux hawk or anything else. But the other way it could go is that the actual spirit of left-hand path, of adversarialism, catches hold. And that spirit, as we talked about, is one of refusing to go along with the herd, refusing to do what they tell you, refusing to accept as gospel what others express to you, and making independent decisions for yourself, even if it means incorporating, reaching out to the darkest forces, both within and without ourselves, that we understand. And that's a path of rigor. And I think if more people are drawn to that path and put themselves in harm's way, so to speak, and undergo those trials and seek those heights and those depths, then they'll transcend this age. And I think they will discover that which in themselves is truly sacred and truly holy, not because it has something to do with a great authority or some celestial light, but because it is their purest and deepest and most true self. And in touching that, they too will be transformed and find something that can guide them, guard them, and lead them where they need to go in this short life. So I personally am optimistic.
Perfectly said, Jack. Thank you so much for coming on Deferred Gnosis. It has been an absolutely wondrous conversation.
It's been great. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everybody for listening. Please connect to deferredgnosis.com to listen to some of the back episodes, and we hope to bring up some more in the future. Until then, Ave and highest cheers.
Thank you for listening and lending your ears to the Deferred Gnosis Podcast. If you wish to connect, please use the contact information in the description below. You can find all the previous episodes and everything else about the podcast at deferredgnosis.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, iTunes, etc., or reach us by email at deferredgnosis@gmail.com. Please send me your topic ideas, suggestions, commentary, things you might want us to discuss. Help us carve out a niche of truth, finding some ground just on the edge of the fringe. And if you're a musician or artist of any kind, please feel free to send me a link of your work. I'd be happy to showcase your work and possibly interview you for the show. We will also soon be streaming on Spotify, so please look out for us there. Until next time, thank you for listening, and highest cheers from Deferred Gnosis. Ave, hails, as above, so below.
attached.
I thought you did a great job. I thought you really did a great job.